Today there is a constant battle in the way that we think, a conflict between science and belief. We see it practically everywhere. Most immediately in the area of vaccination, we of course have anti-vaxxers, people who firmly believe for many reasons that vaccinations are bad and so they're avoiding it. And of course we have the public health officials which are encouraging everyone based on the scientific research and evidence that they have, pointing to them, telling us that we should get our vaccinations done and that that's really the way to actually end the pandemic. Yet this tension is there, with no signs of relenting. And of course, other areas we see the same thing. Finance, for example, people believing in certain developments and those who are referring to economic science, and again, debates over there. And also other areas like religion, politics, practically everything. We see a tension between these two forms of thinking. And the interesting thing about belief and science is that they both actually share something in common. That is that by the objective, they are trying to come to the conclusion on the truth of a certain matter, maybe even the truth of the world. But of course, the approach they take is very different. At least by characteristic, we know that when it comes to belief, it is really very much about referring to our personal opinions and references in our minds to come to certain deductions on the truth. And when it comes to science, it involves a more complicated approach that is generally more convoluted than belief. So the question is this: which one is actually better? Belief or science? Which one is better in helping us understand the truths of the world? Is one more valid than the other? Is one more trustworthy? This is an important question because we tend to actually adopt either belief or science in the way that we think. And as we're trying to understand this world and many of its developments, we need to know which one's actually more appropriate. And interestingly, when it comes to this debate, philosophers would actually tell you that scientific thinking is actually a better way to understanding truths. Now, this might be disappointing to some of you, but the reason why is because science itself is very much rooted and originated from philosophy. Philosophy has always been on the search of discovering the truth of the world, and science was really the offspring of the process. Let me explain. It all started with Aristotle. He was trying to discover the truth of our world. Bear in mind, he lived in a time thousands of years ago, and there were a lot of people around him who claimed to know the truth of the world. But Aristotle believed that the way to actually discover truth is through observation, rather than just relying on someone's word for it. What you notice is that you can easily observe the world around you. And if you are keen enough to the attention and maybe more attentive, you might start to see patterns. And with enough patterns, you might start to see a certain logic of the world. And with that, maybe through enough observation, you can come to some deductions of the world and more or less create a law of nature, if you will, on the certain thing that you're observing. So for example, if today you were a fisherman and you were to go out to sea, and you were to fish every day, and you were to catch these fishes, and if you notice with many occasions that these fishes, these creatures, they can't survive long outside of the water, and they tend to possess scales or fins, and have certain biological characteristics, then with enough observation of that, you could make the deduction that fishes are aquatic creatures. They need to survive in the water, and they tend to have certain characteristics. And this sort of observation and deduction brings you closer to the truth in Aristotle's thinking. Because the difference between the Aristotelian approach and just belief is that with belief, again, we are very much just trusting a person's word for it. But with this approach, what we have is a framework where people can come to the same conclusion. If it is something that I can observe about the fishes, then potentially it's also something other people can observe, which means that at least empirically speaking, since anyone can observe the same things and come to the same deductions, this may very well be the truth, as compared to beliefs. At least by its process, there is a way that we can verify it, but whereas when it comes to belief of someone, until after the fact, we can only trust in the person's opinion. Oftentimes we can't verify it in an empirical sense. Yet Aristotle also knew that his method of thinking about truths is also somewhat flawed and limited, because we can only observe so much with our personal senses. We can only make so much deductions. So he's well aware that we might need some anecdotal evidence, and that we can only make so much deductions about the truths of the world, as limited by our personal senses and observation. Yet his thinking would inspire a lot of philosophers, especially Islamic philosophers. Of course, we know that really the birthplace of mathematics. But most prominently, it inspired Ibn-al-Haytham, who of course in the West we know as Al-Hazan. Al-Haytham was truly prominent in developing the scientific thinking. Realizing the shortcomings of Aristotle's approach, yet being inspired by it, he proposed that beyond just personal observation, we should actually design and conduct experiments, and really through trial and error come to better deductions about the world, that we actually take an intentional effort to test the world around us. And through this experimentation and observation, we can come to better conclusions of all the assumptions and deductions that we might have. And Al-Hasham's thinking later inspired Francis Bacon, of course we know is a prominent English philosopher, and he took it a step further. He not only said that we should actually experiment, but through our experimentation, we should actually try and develop explanations for the things that we're seeing. And these explanations, these hypotheses, as we know it today, are things that we should constantly test in our experimentation. And through trial and error, we can know whether our hypotheses are correct, and if they're not, whether we can formulate other better ones. And the Baconian method is very much the foundation of scientific thinking today. Essentially as an approach, all the way rooted and originated from Aristotle all the way to this point. What it is really is us making observations about the world, doing experimentations, leading us to make deductions that we can formulate into explanations that we could test again and again through trial and error to see whether they hold true as a theory, as we create better theories about the truths of the world. And the major difference, and perhaps the superiority of scientific thinking as opposed to belief, is that potentially people can come to the same conclusions through this process about the certain truths that we have arrived at. And the process is very clear and very formalized. Yet when it comes to belief, of course, it is entirely subjective. We are very much trusting a person's word for it. Yet by characteristic, scientific thinking has a flaw, which is also its advantage. Now the flaw really is this: it works on a form of inductive reasoning. In other words, a logic of induction. Now what I mean is this. For example, if we were to observe that the sun rises every day at a certain time at a certain place and sets at a certain time, we could then through the scientific process come to a conclusion and a theory that the sun rises and sets at a certain time. But again, it happens in retrospect. So what that means is that although we can generally come to this conclusion about the characteristic and behavior of the sun in a certain place, who is to say that tomorrow, prospectively speaking, the sun might not rise? There might be some sort of a cosmic event and the sun is gone. And indeed, this was the critical comment that was provided by David Hume, who challenged it in this sense. Yet this is also its advantage, because the philosopher Karl Popper would actually have us see it as its greatest advantage in the sense that this is the characteristic of scientific thinking. And that is that in scientific thinking and scientific theory, there is the element of it being falsifiable. Now what I mean is that all these conclusions that we arrive at, potentially they can be proven false. Now imagine that today, if I said to you that because we've experimented, we've observed, dogs are usually born with a single tail. Now this is my theory through repeated observation, and as such I'm confident in its conclusion. But because of its inductive nature, this can also be proven wrong. If you were to show me an instance of a dog being born with no tails, or maybe being born with two tails rather than one, then I would be proven wrong. Now you might think that just goes to show that scientific thinking is flawed, but no. What it goes to show is that any theory that results from scientific thinking can be proven both ways. As much as it can be proven correct, it can also be proven wrong. But that also means that overall, the process of proof is there. We can experiment it for ourselves and come to the same conclusion, despite the fact that there's an option of it going either way. Yet when it comes to belief, it is a different situation. To illustrate this, imagine if you met a person and he told you that the world was going to end next month. And maybe he has a certain belief. He's had a dream that an alien visited him and told him that this is going to happen. Now the problem with belief is that it isn't falsifiable. I can't prove, at least until the day itself, that what he's saying is true. And that's exactly the problem. When it comes to belief, we are very much relying on the word of somebody for it. There's no way to prove it either way. So we've got to trust it regardless. So what does all this mean? Does it mean that we should all be scientific in the way that we think about the world? Well, I think we should really see it this way. Belief is actually a very beautiful thing. It's a very human thing. It gives life color and this sense of optimism in many ways. And belief can be a good thing. It can give us hope. Can give us creativity, can drive us. But in certain contexts, we shouldn't rely on belief in making deductions about the world, especially deductions about the material world. Belief may be great in areas like, for example, religion and morality, where we can actually shed our critical and scientific minds and engage in a sense of belief. But in certain contexts, where the consequences may be dire, that's when we should actually employ scientific thinking. Now, I'll give you an example of this. Imagine if today you met a miracle worker, and he says that he's capable of performing miracles. You could choose a believer. It might give you a sense of magic to life, that there's much more, and it could be a great thing. Maybe he's got a good message. And maybe you should believe him for that sense. Maybe he is a magician, and you should believe him for the sake that you'll be entertained. But now, let's imagine this. Today, you are sick for some reason, and this miracle worker is now saying to you that, hey, don't go to the hospital, I can cure you through my miracles. Believe me. I think in that instance, that's when we really have to consider the weight of that truth, especially when it comes to the process of belief. Because the consequences, if we are wrong in our belief, is significant. We should definitely employ a more scientific approach to thinking to arrive to the truth. And this is really it. We should be scientific in matters that truly have a significant outcome, even in areas like finance, where we can easily believe people are telling us certain things. When our own savings are at stake in our future, in our livelihood, we certainly cannot rely on belief alone. We have to be scientific in the way that we approach our deductions. And so you see, although belief and scientific thinking sort of exists side by side with one another and often gets into conflict, there are certain times when belief isn't appropriate. And what science can offer, at least as a way of thinking, is really a framework of bringing us closer to the truth.